So tonight I'm going to talk about AWS AppSync, which is a managed GraphQL service that also has local data store and offline syncing for iOS. Also Android, React.js, React Native, Node.js kind of works on everything. So to give you some background, in 2015 the GraphQL spec was announced. In 2017 the Apollo GraphQL library, which AppSync is based on, was in version 1. And then in April of this year, AppSync was released in its production form. So it's quite new and it's still quite evolving. So why am I talking about this? So I'm the CTO of EUGENE Labs. I am a developer. Some people had a question about that earlier. I've worked previously on offline and real-time apps, so I was interested in how AppSync can solve those problems, as they're not trivial problems. And also I was a GraphQL early adopter at a previous job, so I know some good things and bad things about GraphQL from there. So what is EUGENE? EUGENE is a health startup around genetic testing. So we provide access to genetic testing so people can make informed decisions. Technically speaking, it is a huge combination of different services. So we have patient management system, content management system, blah, 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 lots of things. So using AppSync, this is what EUGENE looks like in a technical sense. So we have clients with a local data store, a single GraphQL endpoint that then talks to all our services that we need to consume. So the GraphQL part of AppSync, who knows about GraphQL? Who's bored of GraphQL? Yes. All right, I'll talk about it a little bit. So GraphQL means that you have one endpoint that multiple clients can then consume, and you send queries to that endpoint for each client. It can mean less requests in some use cases, depending on how your APIs are designed. It has a strong type system which works really well with Swift, and it has a really nice self-documenting feature that makes it easy for people to learn it and to write queries for their clients. So when I used GraphQL a year ago, it was nice, but it had many problems. We had lots of boilerplate code. We had a whole lot of complexity for not a lot of benefit, because we didn't have actually more. We had one client, so we didn't really need the benefits that GraphQL was giving us. And it just meant that we had a lot of extra code to maintain, and it just didn't seem like it was working that well. But AppSync GraphQL this year has a lot more features, and it gets rid of a lot more of those problems that I had. So now, being built on Apollo, which we didn't have when we started, you get the client-side code generation that gets rid of a whole lot of boilerplate code. You have the Xcode add-ons that make it really easy to use GraphQL inside of Xcode. And you're able to have the GraphQL appear next to the view controller that you're working on, and it just makes it really nice. The AWS console makes it really obvious what resolvers you're using, what endpoints you're pointing to, and it provides some additional types that are really useful that the GraphQL spec didn't have. And then if you're already on AWS, you get a whole lot of benefits through integrations like Cognito, Cloud, I've forgotten the name of it, and other things. So if you're already there, it makes things a lot quicker to build. So this is what it kind of looks like when you're using the Apollo add-ons. So you'll have a GraphQL file that goes with your view controller file. And so you'll just put your GraphQL query in it, and then you'll be able to use the generated types in a fetch command and go from there. So it's really neat. In the console, you can see it's loaded in the schema that we've put in. There's also ways to automatically generate a schema now, so you don't necessarily have to write your GraphQL from scratch. And then you've got all the resolvers on the left there, so you can see what endpoints you're consuming. So resolvers, so if GraphQL is like your single endpoint, the resolvers are all of the data that you're consuming. So AppSync will allow you to use Lambda resolvers, which Lambda is like on-demand compute resources, existing HTTP endpoints and the DynamoDB, or static ones, which is just if you've got some static data, you can just put it in a resolver. It also provides resolver mapping, and this is somewhere where we had a lot of code that just churned JSON from one form to another when we did it originally. And so having a templating language right in the AWS console really simplified a lot of things. So this is showing you how you've got data coming in context.data, and you're able to transform it into a new form of JSON really easily just inside the console. You don't need to write custom code for it. So then the real-time data part of AppSync is done using GraphQL subscriptions. So it's not, it kind of seems like it's going to be magic when you start reading about it, but it's actually not. So when you're using GraphQL, you have different types. So you have queries and mutations. So if you call a mutation, you're able to put that mutation and then listen to it. But if you have DynamoDB underneath or a HTTP endpoint underneath, it's not going to know that any data has changed unless you send through a mutation. So it's not magic knowing that data is changing. You have to still call a mutation for it to query on. It's implemented over WebSockets, so it's not for everything. You don't want to subscribe to everything and then use up all the battery. You definitely want it to just be real time. I need this data right when it happens. Not just, oh, I can just query this when I go into the view controller next time. So this is an example of the GraphQL at the top and then the Swift at the bottom. So you've got a mutation add post, and then you've got a subscription that's connected to that mutation add post. And then you just call subscribe in your code somewhere and you'll be notified when that mutation has gone off and you'll get the result. So offline functionality, again, the documentation on this is a little bit vague. So what it wants you to do is build an optimistic UI assuming that your mutation has been successful, and it'll cache that data locally, and then if you're offline, it'll send that data to the server later. It does talk about basic and customizable conflict resolution, but I could not find where to do that. So I put an asterisk on that. It says it on the box, but I could not find the actual detail. If you want to get started, it's really easy. So you can just go in and start a sample project with the event app, which is kind of a good basic view of everything. The chat app, which is specifically for subscriptions and real-time data. And AWS will set up all the infrastructure that you need to get that running. And then you can just run a client app to talk to it. So I think it's really good for new projects. It will speed up a lot of things. I've seen teams spend months and months building bits and pieces that was able to be done with this quite quickly. However, because it's new, it's not really sophisticated enough for existing projects yet. Like, I would like to see where it goes before I would move an existing project onto AppSync. And that's it. Any questions? Yes.
What would you say is the biggest? Thanks for the talk. Great. What would you say is the biggest benefit of using AppSync rather than just rolling your own GraphQL Apollo server, and vice versa? What is the biggest downside?
So There's nothing wrong with rolling your own GraphQL server. I think in terms of maintaining it, AWS AppSync will be easier to maintain because it is a bit more visual. So I know when we had our own GraphQL server, it was quite difficult to work out what was talking to what and to get through all the levels, whereas here it's quite easy to see what's being talked to. It's quite easy to explain. I guess it's kind of like anything. Like if you want to do your own, do your own if that's fun. But if you want to save time, you can do this. I think a bigger team has the resources to make their own and to optimize it in certain places. So I know with this, finding out how the caching works and where I can cache different things is a lot harder than when we had our own. So I think at scale, that might be something to look at. But for beginning, I think it just saves you so much time to use this.
G'day, Kate.
Hey.
I guess the question I have is what specifically Eugene Labs is using this infrastructure for? Like, is there a specific use case you needed the synchronization offline, online, or GraphQL specifically versus, more traditional approach?
Yeah, so the offline and online and real-time stuff is more of a benefit. So for Eugene, we don't necessarily have data that you need to know immediately. Like we can definitely wait a couple of minutes to load something again. Offline is just nice. So in case of Eugene, we do have a family history survey that you put in all of your medical history. And so if you go offline while you're entering that would be really annoying. So this way you can keep entering it and it'll be stored locally and then it'll go up when you're online. Because we don't have multiple people editing the same data, we won't have that conflict issues. So that's why I can't give you the background on that. But it's definitely, because it's basically free with AppSync. And GraphQL, I would advocate for something that has so many services that we have. So rather than having...
So what you're saying there is it's a good aggregator?
Yes.
So
yeah.
If you've got a lot of different backends or things you want to aggregate together into a single data source,
yes,
it's good for that.
Yeah, yeah. And it not only is it an aggregator, but it's really good when you've got a mobile client and a web client and an Android client, that they can have their own queries on the same endpoint, and you don't have to create different backends for each client, which you would do to create the most optimal experience, right? So yeah, it saves us that way as well.
Yeah, there's a free AWS replace your APIs with AppSync session on 26th of November. So that's last Monday of the month.
Question. FYI. Thanks. Just a question on the using AppSync on an existing project. Can you elaborate a bit more on what the challenges might be or why you would want to use it?
I guess, so maybe when I use the word existing, I should probably replace that perhaps with complex. So if you have a project that's already got some offline functionality that you're using from the solution that you've built yourself, I'm not sure that AppSync is sophisticated enough for that. If the app is simple and it's just about querying data, you have a lot of services and you want to put a layer above that to aggregate everything, then sure. I think the GraphQL part being based on Apollo is quite stable. It's when you get into the real-time data and the offline stuff that I'm just not sure that that's sophisticated enough for an app that has already solved those problems. If you haven't solved those problems yet, I think this is a really good place to start. But you may outgrow the functionality that's there. They are doing a lot of development on it, so it might grow with you, but for the moment it's hard to say.
I had one question about, I guess, like behind the GraphQL. My experience was, the clients make their own queries, which is awesome. I really enjoyed my last experience with GraphQL. But then the clients make all these queries and they have no idea what it costs to make that query. So like, I want this field. That field comes from 5 layers deep. In your experience, is that a problem for your apps, given that you're aggregating multiple services? Is everything the same cost, or potentially will that be a problem for you?
It will, but it would have been anyway. So I don't think that's like a GraphQL yes or no question. It's something that I think you have to keep an eye on and add caching where you need to. And yeah, I don't know if you can do much more than that. But I think the benefits that it gives you outweigh those sorts of things, and you can always just work them out case by case.